The air in Hackensack, New Jersey, in 1954, carried a particular fragrance, a heavy blend of damp pavement cooling after a light rain and the clean scent of pine needles resting on the earth. It was a Tuesday evening, a time when the week had settled into its steady, rhythmic pulse. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the suburban streets wrapped in a velvety indigo quiet, a silence so deep it felt as though the entire neighborhood were holding its breath. Inside a modest house on Prospect Avenue, the air was different. It was perfectly still and carefully controlled to maintain a sense of absolute order. A single lamp glowed in the corner, its light a warm, golden nectar that pooled around the base. This illumination cast a long, soft shadow across a rug whose fibers had been vacuumed into meticulous parallel lines, each one a testament to a quiet and deliberate precision. From the street, no sound intruded. The world beyond had fallen away, leaving only the silence of the room. The windows were sealed tight, their thick panes of glass acting as a silent barrier between the mundane world and the sanctuary within. In the center of the room, a microphone stand waited in the stillness. It was crafted of polished chrome, a surface that was smooth and strikingly cool to the touch, and it caught the singular amber light of the lamp, reflecting it in a distorted, shimmering gleam. This house did not carry the typical sense of a home. There was no aroma of cooking or perfume. Instead, the air was filled with the clean scent of ozone, the warmth of electronics humming with energy, and the faint, dry scent of seasoned timber. Rudy Van Gelder wore thin, white cotton gloves, his fingers moving with the slow, deliberate precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. He moved through his parents' quiet living room, a space that felt more like a cathedral of sound than a domestic dwelling. This was not a recording studio in any traditional sense. There were no sterile, soundproof booths or heavy, industrial steel doors to isolate the music from the world. It was a living room, expansive and airy, with a remarkably high ceiling that seemed to pull the eyes upward until the wooden rafters disappeared into the soft, velvet shadows of the peak. The walls were not smothered in thick, grey acoustic foam. Instead, they were living walls, finished in plaster and polished wood, breathing in a slow, steady rhythm with the rest of the house. Ruddy reached out and adjusted a heavy fabric curtain, sliding it exactly 2 inches to the left along its metal rod. He stepped back, his movements silent on the floor, and listened to the profound weight of the deep silence. He held a quiet, unwavering belief that the room itself was an instrument, as vital and resonant as any horn or piano. The furniture had been pushed carefully to the very perimeter of the space, leaving a wide, open expanse of dark hardwood that gleamed like a still lake in the dim light. When a saxophone player stepped onto that wood, their footsteps created a sharp, wooden report that echoed briefly against the high walls before dying away into the stillness. The recording console sat tucked away in a small, cozy alcove adjacent to the main room. It was a beautiful, complex machine of silver knobs and vintage dials, built entirely by hand with obsessive mechanical care. The metal faceplate was a matte grey, cool to the touch, and the thin, delicate needles on the VU meters rested perfectly at 0, waiting for the very first breath of music. Ruddy sat in a simple, sturdy folding chair, watching the room through a small, clear window. He did not speak. He simply watched the golden dust motes dancing lazily in the soft, amber glow of the control board lights. The musicians began to arrive one by one, bringing the crisp, cold evening air in with them in the folds of their coats. They opened their heavy, battered leather cases, cases that smelled of metallic brass oil, old cedar wood, and the scent of worn, purple velvet. A trumpet was carefully assembled, its silver valves clicking softly in the quiet. A thin wooden reed was whetted with patient, rhythmic care. But before a single note was ever played, there was the silent ritual of the room. The musicians stood in the center of the high-ceilinged space, standing perfectly still and respecting the unique, invisible geometry of the house. The architecture itself seemed to demand a certain volume, a certain reverence of spirit. The large panes of glass in the windows appeared to vibrate with a faint, invisible anticipation, holding the heavy, expectant pressure of the silence just before the sound finally began to bloom. In the quiet, hollow center of the recording studio, where the shadows stretched long across the floor, stood the listener. It was a Neumann U47 microphone, a piece of engineering that commanded the space around it with a quiet, industrial dignity. It was a heavy cylinder, substantial and imposing in its matte chrome finish, held aloft by a complex shock mount that resembled a delicate spider's web woven from steel and taut, black elastic. This microphone was not merely a tool for recording. It was a sacred vessel for sound. Within the protective embrace of its metal casing, shielded by a finely woven wire mesh grill that felt cool and steady, sat a single vacuum tube. This was the VF-14 tube, an architecture of glass and intricate metal filaments. As the power supply was clicked into the on position, a soft hum began to travel through the thick cables, and the tube started its slow journey toward warmth. It was a process that could not be rushed. It was a slow, deliberate awakening, like a sleeper stirring in the soft light of morning. The heat began to radiate outward from the glowing core of the microphone, gradually warming the pocket of air trapped inside the metal grill. If you leaned in close, standing in the hushed stillness of the room, you could smell the heat as it bloomed. It was a nostalgic, metallic, and slightly dusty scent, reminiscent of a radiator clicking to life on a morning in October. The U-47 was waiting, poised with patience to capture more than just the notes of a song. It was designed to capture the very air that lived around the music. It listened for the soft, hesitant intake of breath that a singer takes just before a phrase begins. It listened for the tactile friction of a finger sliding down the wound wire of a bass string, a sound as textured as wood. It listened for the subtle shifting of weight from one foot to another on the floor, the quietest movements of a body in the space. The mesh grill was a cold, geometric grid. Behind this barrier, the diaphragm, a thin membrane sputtered with gold, sat in absolute stillness. It was a surface so sensitive that it could detect the turbulence of air caused by a hand simply passing through the space. It stood there, a silent and watchful sentinel, gracefully converting the physical pressure of the room into a steady electrical current, turning the invisible vibrations of the air into something permanent and eternal. The setting had shifted across the map of the city, yet that singular, breathless reverence for the air remained entirely unchanged. It was the spring of 1959. The place was a cavernous, echoing room on 30th Street in New York City, a space that breathed with the ghosts of its own past. It had once been a church, a sanctuary of prayer and song, and that sacred stillness still clung to every corner. The ceilings were impossibly high, soaring upward until they lost themselves in a soft, dusty gloom of unpolished wood beams and ancient plaster. Below, the floor was a vast, sprawling expanse of hardwood, deeply scarred and smoothed by decades of use, a map of every footstep that had ever crossed its surface. In this room, the silence was not merely an absence of noise. It was heavy and tangible. It had a physical weight that settled on the shoulders. The air felt thick and textured, as if the thousands of sermons preached there in years gone by were still hanging invisibly in the rafters, mingling with the stillness. Miles Davis stood perfectly still in the very center of that floor. He did not move a single muscle, his presence anchored to the spot. He held his trumpet loosely at his side, the cool brass surface of the instrument reflecting the soft overhead light. High above, behind a thick, soundproof glass wall, the recording engineers sat in the control booth. They looked down upon the floor below like silent observers stationed in a lighthouse, watching the sea of wood and shadow. Then, with a soft, mechanical click, the tape machine began to roll. The reels were heavy, polished aluminum, spinning with a rhythmic, hypnotic shhhshhhshhh sound that filled the small space of the booth. The brown magnetic tape spooled steadily from left to right, a dark, endless river of rust passing over the glowing recording heads with clockwork precision. Down on the floor, there was no cluttered sheet music resting on the stands, no dense forests of notes to navigate. There were only sketches, simple marks, modes. The musicians waited in the pregnant pause, their breathing synchronized with the quiet. Then the pianist played a chord, a single, suspended cluster of notes that seemed to shimmer as it hung in the air, drifting slowly upward toward the vaulted ceiling. The natural, cavernous reverb of the old church caught the sound and held it close, letting it decay with agonizing slowness over long, beautiful seconds. It was a sound that felt like the steady, rhythmic pulse of late-night rain against a windowpane. The room was not fighting the sound. It was cradling it in its wooden arms. The silence between those notes was just as loud, just as vital as the notes themselves. It was more than a song. It was a recording of patience, a capture of the very soul of time. Many years later, in the soft shadows of a different room, a different kind of silence was being manufactured with deliberate care. The instrument was called the Mellotron. It sat tucked away in the quiet corner of a studio in London, a heavy, solid wooden cabinet painted in a shade of white that had softened with age. To the eye, it looked much like a traditional organ, but inside its frame, it functioned as a mechanical library. Underneath the smooth, cool ivory of the keys, there was no movement of air, no hollow pipes, and no resonant strings. There was only tape. Beneath every single individual key on the keyboard sat a thin, dark strip of magnetic tape, exactly 8 seconds long. When a finger pressed a key, a complex and intricate mechanism engaged deep within the machine. A small rubber pinch roller moved forward with a gentle, mechanical certainty. It pressed the tape against a smooth playback head. A motor began to spin, pulling the tape downward with a steady, rhythmic tension. The sound that emerged was ghostly and thin, a spectral echo. It was the sound of violins recorded many years ago, in a different room, by people whose names had been forgotten. But the Mellotron added its own physical texture to the notes. The tapes were old and fragile. They fluttered as they moved, creating a subtle, wavering pitch that felt like a dream. The motor hummed with a low, constant vibration, a soothing thrum that traveled through the heavy wood and moved across the floor. When you held a chord, the entire machine seemed to breathe like a living thing. The tapes would run for their 8 seconds, and then, if you did not lift your finger, The sound simply stopped. The tape had run its course. A small metal spring would then snap the tape back to the beginning with a faint, sharp click, leaving it ready to be played again. It was a loop of time, a contained memory of a whole orchestra, trapped inside a wooden box and waiting to be summoned by the light pressure of a keystroke. The smell of the machine as it worked was distinct and nostalgic. The scent of hot motor oil, the friction of rubber belts, and the dry, earthy aroma of warm plywood. In the quiet, leafy neighborhood of St. John's Wood, London, there is a modest staircase that leads down to the hallowed space of Studio 2. The stairs are covered in thick, industrial linoleum, a practical grey material that muffles each footstep before the room opens up with the unexpected scale of a gymnasium. The defining feature of this room was not the height of the walls, but the floor that stretched out across the entire expanse. It was a masterpiece of parquet, with blocks of solid oak laid in a precise, interlocking herringbone pattern. There were hundreds upon hundreds of these wooden blocks, each one fitting snugly against the next in a rhythmic zigzag. They were varnished to a soft, dull sheen that caught the overhead light without glaring, glowing with a gentle, amber warmth. The wood was the color of clover honey and well-steeped tea, darkened slightly by the passage of time and the shuffling of many feet. Each individual block had absorbed the invisible vibrations of 1,000 recording sessions, holding the history of the music deep within its grain. The floor was hard, reflective, and acoustically unforgiving, polished to a state of perfect preservation. Large, heavy acoustic screens on metal wheels were scattered around the room, standing like silent, beige dividers. They were covered in a coarse fabric, stained slightly with age and the gentle touch of many hands over the years. When an engineer walked across the parquet floor, their footsteps had a sharp attack and a quick, clean decay. Click, click, click. The sound echoed briefly in the stillness before vanishing into the rafters. In the corner, an upright piano stood against a whitewashed brick wall where the white paint was thick and textured over the mortar. The piano was slightly out of tune, possessing a mellow and honest character. The wool felts on the hammers were worn down, compressed by years of striking the steel strings during late-night sessions. The air in Studio 2 was always cool, a subterranean chill insulated by feet of solid brick and the heavy earth. The studio felt like a bunker designed for the absolute preservation of sound. There were no windows to the outside world, leaving the room in a state of perpetual, quiet stillness. Time did not exist here. There was only the steady, comforting glow of the red light above the door and the rhythmic, silent spinning of the tape reels. We returned to the house in New Jersey, where time seems to have slowed to a gentle, steady crawl. It is much later now, and the night has deepened into a profound, velvety stillness that wraps around the building like a soft shroud. Outside, the traffic on Prospect Avenue has ceased entirely, leaving only the immense silence of the suburban night and the occasional whisper of the wind through the trees. Inside the house, the only light in the world seems to be the vacuum tubes glowing softly inside the heavy amplifiers. They cast a warm, amber light, pulsing with a low, steady energy that illuminates the shadows of the control room and the fine dust motes dancing in the air. Rudy Van Gelder sat at his console, a figure of absolute, quiet concentration. He was wearing a different pair of clean, white cotton gloves now, his hands moving with deliberate care as he handled the master tape. The tape was acetate, fragile and precious, a thin, dark ribbon of captured sound that required the gentlest possible touch. He threaded it through the machine with a practiced, ritualistic rhythm that had become second nature over the years. He guided the tape over the smooth metal of the playback head, under the polished silver of the capstan, through the delicate tension arm, and finally onto the take-up reel. Every movement was slow and purposeful, a silent ceremony of technical precision. He pressed a button, and the solenoid clicked, a sharp, mechanical snap that resonated through the small control room, a sound of finality that cut through the silence. The reels began to turn, spinning in a hypnotic, silent circle. In the living room, the musicians were tired. Their shoulders slumped slightly under the weight of the long hours and the gravity of the music. The energy had shifted from the sharp anticipation of the early evening into a deep, quiet introspection. The saxophone player sat on a simple folding chair, his head bowed and his eyes closed, feeling the cool weight of the brass instrument in his hands. The thin wooden reed of his instrument had grown dry in the pores. He wet it again, a small, rhythmic act of preparation. The room was noticeably warmer now. The collective body heat of the men and the constant, radiating warmth of the electronics had raised the temperature by 3 degrees, making the air feel heavier and more intimate, like a soft blanket draped over the session. Ruddy did not use equalization to artificially brighten the sound or mask the natural character of the room. Instead, he worked with the physical space, adjusting the microphone placement by mere millimeters. He moved the microphone closer to the golden bell of the saxophone, positioning it to capture the most subtle nuances of the performance. He wanted the sound of the breath, the grain of the air escaping the instrument, and the human texture of the vibrato. The result was a sound that was dark, velvety, and remarkably close. It sounded as though the musician was sitting right next to you in the dark, playing a private melody just for you while the rest of the world slept. Deep within the dark, metallic enclosure of the recording equipment, a hidden and microscopic world was quietly active, buzzing with a slow and rhythmic life all its own. At the very center of this miniature universe sat the vacuum tube, the glowing, pulsing heart of the entire signal chain. To the casual eye, it appeared as a simple glass bottle, no larger than a person's thumb, but within its transparent walls, it held a vast and silent power. Inside that fragile shell, held in a state of absolute and perfect vacuum, electrons were beginning to stir, boiling softly off a heated cathode like invisible steam rising from the surface of a still, dark pond. They floated through the empty void, a silent, ghostly migration drawn toward the steady, magnetic pull of a positively charged metal plate. This was a stream of pure, invisible energy, a continuous and shimmering river that carried the weight, the texture, and the true color of the music itself. It was not a cold or clinical calculation of zeros and ones, but a physical, flowing stream, moving with the organic grace of water winding through a deep stream bed. When the trumpet played a sudden, bright note that climbed high into the air, the stream of electrons widened and surged with a vibrant, glowing intensity. When the bass notes rumbled low and deep, vibrating through the floorboards, the stream pulsed in a slow, rhythmic swell that felt like a heavy and comforting heartbeat. As the hours passed, the glass of the tube began to radiate a soft, steady heat that warmed the air around it. If you were to reach out and touch your finger to the smooth, curved surface, it would burn with a sharp intensity. But here, in the quiet sanctuary of the studio, that heat was absolutely essential. A cold tube would produce a sound that was thin, sharp, and brittle, like the breaking of dry glass, but a warm tube sounded round, full, and infinitely deep. It possessed a gentle, amber magic that softened the sharpest edges of the sound, smoothing them into something beautiful. It took the piercing, metallic attack of a crashing cymbal and rounded it off with a delicate, masterful touch, coating every frequency in a shimmering, honey-like layer of golden harmonic distortion. In the background, the heavy amplifiers maintained a constant, comforting hum that filled the silence. It was a low, 60-cycle hum, the steady, rhythmic breath of the electricity grid itself, a grounding drone that remained ever present just below the threshold of conscious hearing. It was the deep, rhythmic heartbeat of the studio, a soft and constant reminder that the entire room was alive, vibrating with the calm, steady, and eternal current of the world outside. Back in the high-ceilinged, converted church on 30th Street, the recording session had drifted into a quiet pause. The musicians had stepped out for a cigarette, leaving their instruments resting on their stands. The room was suddenly, profoundly empty, yet it felt heavy with the lingering energy of the music. The microphones, silver and steady, were still open, their sensitive diaphragms catching every minute tremor of the stillness. In the dimly lit control booth, the engineers left the faders up. They leaned back and listened to the empty room, letting the silence fill their headphones. They could hear the settling of the building itself, a slow, rhythmic breath of stone and timber. The aged wood of the floor expanded and contracted with the gentle shift of the humidity, a subtle stretching of the grain that sounded like a soft sigh. High above, a beam in the ceiling creaked, a sound like a great wooden ship adjusting to the slow pull of the tide in a quiet harbor. Outside, far below the city streets, a subway train passed through the deep dark of the earth. It was a low, subterranean rumble, barely a vibration at all, shaking the heavy foundation of the church just enough to be felt by the soles of the feet through the thick rugs, but not enough to be heard. The air in the room was cool and stale, smelling faintly of old coffee and the lingering scent of floor wax. This silence was not empty. It was a physical thing, full of texture and weight. It was the room tone, that unique, invisible fingerprint of the space. This one was vast and hollow. It sounded like the interior of a great cathedral at midnight. The tiny dust motes that floated in the dim light seemed to hang perfectly suspended, caught in the absolute stillness of the space, drifting on currents too slow to see. The engineers watched the VU meters. The needles sat at the far left, resting in their cradles, twitching only occasionally as a door closed somewhere deep in the building, a distant, muffled thud that rippled through the quiet. The Mellotron's tapes were agging, their surfaces growing thinner and more fragile with every passing year that they lived within the darkness of the wooden cabinet. With every gentle, deliberate press of a key, the thin layer of magnetic oxide coating on the plastic ribbon was subjected to a microlayer of friction. The playback head, a smooth and cool piece of silvered metal, rubbed against the moving tape as it passed, reading the magnetic information hidden in the microscopic particles, but also slowly, inevitably wearing them away. This was the quiet, melancholic beauty of the machine. It was not a static object, but a living, breathing document of its own decay. The flute sound held on the tape was originally recorded in the stillness of a studio in 1964, a single musician's breath captured forever in magnetic dust. But played back many years later, that sound had subtly and beautifully changed. The bright, high frequencies were gone, smoothed away by the persistent friction of time and the repetition of play. The sound was duller, warmer, and more distant, like a soft light glowing through the folds of a thick velvet curtain. When a full chord was pressed, 35 individual strips of tape moved in a synchronized mechanical dance, being pulled down by a long, heavy metal capstan that turned with a steady, rhythmic pulse. The electric motor strained ever so slightly under the weight of the mechanical load, emitting a low, comforting hum that resonated through the heavy frame. The pitch would wobble with a gentle, hypnotic instability, a phenomenon known as wow and flutter. The pitch dipped down, then recovered its strength, then dipped once more in a slow, oceanic rhythm. It sounded like a warped record spinning on a heavy platter, or a cherished memory that was slowly losing its sharpest edges and its focus. The interior of the machine was a mysterious and intricate tangle of steel springs, nylon pulleys, and wooden guide rails. It was a clockwork orchestra operating in the dark. When the keys were eventually released, the tension springs retracted with a soft, rhythmic thwump, pulling the long tapes back into their designated storage bins. The entire machine seemed to exhale a weary sigh. It went back to sleep, the heavy flywheel spinning down more and more slowly until its motion became imperceptible, finally coming to a complete and silent halt in the quiet of the room. At Abbey Road, the sound did not simply end when the singer stopped. It was captured and sent on a quiet, unseen journey through the building's hidden channels. The signal from the microphone traveled down a long, dark copper wire, snaking through the floorboards and moving deep into the cold foundations of the building. There, behind a heavy, locked door in the basement, was the echo chamber. It was a small, narrow room with walls covered in white ceramic tiles, tiles that felt cold, hard, and smooth to the touch. No windows broke the darkness, and the air was perfectly still. The room was empty except for a large speaker at one end and a silver microphone at the other. It was a damp, subterranean space, smelling faintly of wet concrete and the cool, earthy scent of old drainage. The engineers would send the sound of a voice down into this quiet vault. The speaker would play the voice into the tiles, and the sound would immediately begin to bounce. It hit the left wall, the ceiling, the floor, and the back wall in a rapid, invisible sequence. It shattered into 1,000 tiny reflections, creating a thick, washing texture of sound. The microphone at the other end caught this chaotic, shimmering sound, which felt like the spectral voice of a ghost. This wet, reflective signal was sent back upstairs to the control room and carefully mixed underneath the dry vocal. It gave the singer a shimmering halo of light and space, a resonance that seemed to stretch forever. But in the chamber itself, there was no music. There was only the disembodied sound of a voice, echoing through the dark, bouncing off the cold tiles over and over again. It slowly decayed into the heavy, damp air of the basement. The door remained locked and silent. The sound lived there, alone in the shadows, reverberating until the fader was finally pulled down, and the room returned once more to its cold, ceramic silence. The silver faders on the mixing console are all down now, resting in a neat, silent row at the bottom of their metal tracks. Each one was lowered with a deliberate touch, silencing the channels for the night. The urgent glow of the red recording lights has finally turned off, leaving behind a soft, velvet darkness that fills the corners of the room. The massive, soundproof doors are closed, their heavy seals locking tight against the outer world to keep the peace held safely within. The machines are slowly cooling, shedding the warmth of the electronics into the quiet, still air. The delicate glass of the vacuum tubes ticks softly as it contracts, a rhythmic, microscopic sound of materials returning to rest. The sharp, electric smell of ozone fades away, replaced by the dry, comforting scent of dust settling slowly onto the floorboards. The metal reels have stopped their spinning, and the magnetic tape is safely boxed and resting on the shelf. The lights in the hallway flicker once, then go dark, surrendering the long corridor to the shadows. The silence of the studio is absolute, a deep and heavy protective blanket that cradles the room in perfect calm. The air does not move, it stays perfectly still. The room waits in the darkness, and the polished wood of the piano waits too, soaking up the quiet. The night continues, outside and inside, as time slows to a rhythmic crawl. Nothing moves, nothing sounds. There is only the drift, a slow tide of peace moving through the dark.